All right, hi everyone. I hope you guys are doing well, staying warm. So my plan with this video is to cover the first part of our chapter on sexuality. I think that we should have plenty of time to finish up most of this on Thursday, so I plan for this to be a pretty quick video. My purpose for recording this video, I didn't feel like it was a good idea to expect us to be safely back on campus and in the classroom by Tuesday. I'm recording this video on Monday afternoon. Right now it looks pretty nasty out there. So I anticipate, that virtual was probably called for, but then I also had to consider whether to record something or do a live WebEx the way that I did on last Thursday. My thinking here is that there is a possibility that the power might go out. So if the power were to go out while we were trying to do the WebEx, then that would really disrupt our ability to communicate this information. So I thought it would be better to go ahead and record a lecture video that you guys could watch at any point. I do not plan to do an activity in this video, although we may do one on Thursday. So no worries about that. Remember that last Thursday, we did have activity 5 that we talked about in the WebEx, and it's going to be closing at the end of the day on this upcoming Thursday, which will be February 18th. I think I have it set to close at 11:59 p.m. that day. So let me know if you have questions. A lot of you have already done that. The other announcement I have before I jump into a little bit of lecture here is that exam 2 is going to be opening right after our class time on Thursday, assuming that nothing happens to throw things off. After 2020, I've sort of come to the conclusion that I really shouldn't make plans too much, but that's the idea anyway. We'll have we'll have exam 2 opening right after class time on Thursday, the 18th. So let me know. I will set up the accommodations the same way that I set them up for exam 1. If you need something different, please let me know. Okay, so my plan today is to cover a little bit of our chapter on sexuality and then finish up the rest of that in class on Thursday, hopefully in class. So this chapter is on issues related to sexuality. So if we're going to talk about sexuality, a good place to start would be generally what are people's attitudes towards sexual activity. One thing that your textbook mentions is this concept of casual sex. So the idea when we're thinking about casual sex, that sex is happening in a relationship that is not committed. Now, I think that the attitudes that we have about sex have certainly changed over time and will probably continue to change. At the time that this research was done, and I don't know exactly what year this was, but it hasn't been that long ago, the people who answered the survey said that they believed that sex between unmarried people is fine as long as it occurs in an affectionate, committed relationship. So a couple things I'm hearing there. One thing I'm hearing is that there is a concern that sex needs to take place in an affectionate relationship. I think the idea here is that individuals are consenting, that there is no coercion, and certainly that's an important component to keep in mind as we talk about sexuality. The other thing that's interesting here is that most people in our culture, this is in the United States, believed that sex should take place in a committed relationship. Not necessarily marriage, but committed. Now, I do think this has changed. In the past, it was viewed as more of a stigma against sex outside of marriage. So there are many potential reasons why this might be changing, and would certainly be a question that I would ask you guys if we were in class. Why do you think these attitudes have changed? There is a difference in maybe the way we view religion, the way that media plays a role. Like if you look at the sexuality and the media that we have today versus in previous generations, certainly sex is not something that's kind of hidden, a taboo topic anymore so much as it used to be. But still, people are saying that they believe that sex should happen in a committed relationship. Of course, I do expect that this will probably continue to change over time. Now, how do we know about people's attitudes towards sex? Simple answer, we ask them. That's really the only way to get this information. So this is coming from a survey, bearing in mind that people bring a lot of things with them when they answer a survey. So their own personal experiences and what sort of answer do they think the researcher wants to hear. So remembering all of that, men on a survey are more likely to say that they are comfortable with casual, uncommitted sex. Now, if we think about this, it's possible that this is not the case. It's possible that men feel like they're supposed to say that they're comfortable with uncommitted sex. And it's possible that women feel like they're not supposed to say that they're comfortable with uncommitted sex. Or it could be that men and women truly do feel this way, and maybe it has to do with this sexual double standard. So this is always something that makes for interesting conversations in class. If I had you guys right in front of me, I would ask the question, like, what do we think of a male who has had multiple partners? And what do we think of a female who has had multiple partners? And why do we view those situations differently? Another way to think about this, do parents parent sons and daughters differently? Absolutely. In many cases, not in every case, but in many cases. But what about specifically in respect to sex? So if we're looking at the things that parents say to their children about sex, do parents have different expectations and different parenting techniques depending on if they're talking about a son or a daughter? I think in the past, students have overwhelmingly said yes, parents parent sons and daughters differently. And then the question is why? Why is it different? And then one answer that students often give is that, well, a daughter could get pregnant. So there's that. But then a son could get someone pregnant. So why is that viewed differently? Like, why is it? And then there's the expectation that a woman is expected to take care of the child and a man is not. But then why is that the case? So if we get down to the heart of the matter, we have a sexual double standard that says that women should be more responsible when it comes to sexual behavior because women have that ability to get pregnant. And then I think that does not mean that men should not be, responsible when it comes to sexual activity as well. But certainly there is a double standard here. What's ironic is that we tend to have the standard still that women should be more chaste. And yet we also live in a culture that tends to hypersexualize women as well. So it's certainly an interesting thing, and I would love to have that conversation. Maybe if we're back in the classroom on Thursday, we could still have some of that conversation then when I have you guys there with me. All right, so what about other sexual related issues? So when we're looking at the attitudes that cultures have, we can compare, different cultures, and we might label this particular culture as being more conservative or less conservative. So your textbook makes the point that the United States holds more conservative views than a lot of other countries, and it lists those here. Certainly we have less conservative views than a lot of different cultures as well. But I think our attitudes here are changing about some of these issues. It talks about premarital sex, teenage sex, extramarital sex, same-sex relationships. So one question that I have here that I would ask you guys is, has our attitude about teenage sex changed? I can see how our attitudes about premarital sex, extramarital sex, same-sex relationships have changed. But have we changed our views on teenagers having sex? Well, this is another time where I miss having you guys so we could have this conversation. Now, where are we getting this information from? Surveys. Are people telling the truth on surveys? Probably not. Certainly, if we're talking to teenagers about sexual behavior, we can't be sure that we're getting accurate information here. You get the most accurate information from letting the person know that it's anonymous, but still, it's hard to get that. Regardless, based off of our surveys, almost all Americans say that they had sex before they got married, and they're having sex at earlier ages. Now, I do think this is something that's happening. My question is, has our attitude about it changed? Are we more accepting of teenagers having sex than we previously were? And how does that impact our sex education classes? So this is where, if I had you guys, I always ask students about, like, what sort of sex education did you receive from schools, from parents? Like, whose responsibility is it to teach children about sexual behaviors? And of course, a lot of us, the answer is parents. And yes, parents is the answer. So then should schools not be involved? And then the answer that I usually hear from students is that parents mess this up a lot of the time, but then schools can mess this up too. So then the question is, what sort of sex education should we be providing? And usually from students in the past, they've said either they didn't get any sex education at school, or it was very like abstinence only sort of thing. And I think we would agree that in most situations, that's the best outcome, right? I mean, for teenagers to be having sex, certainly there are all kinds of ways that people can get hurt. So I think we would say in many situations, maybe that's the best outcome, but it's not necessarily the most realistic expectation. So then the argument is that if we could, have information about like safe sexual behaviors, then we could have better outcomes as well. So the concern, I think, with abstinence only sex education is that maybe it comes from a good place of genuinely, wanting to spare, heartache and maybe health issues and things as well. But it's not necessarily practical, and it can leave individuals with, not having good sources of information. So, and then I always am interested to hear what you guys have to say about sex education as well. One things that we do see is that, at least on a survey, teens are more likely to say that they're using contraception, and we do tend to see that the teen birth rate is lower. Now, that's as our culture at large, so like American birth rate. But when I was doing my thesis, now this has been, like 7 or so years ago, probably working with data that's now 10 years old. But Mississippi was number one in the teen birth rate, I believe, at that point. So I don't know if that's changed or not, but certainly there are going to be regional differences in this as well. Okay. So we think about the attitudes that we have and how those are related to the behaviors that follow. One thing that we see is that couples who have sex very early on in their relationship tend to have poorer outcomes. Now, this does not necessarily mean that having sex on the first date will lead to a breakup or an unhappy relationship. Not necessarily, but there is a correlation here. This is correlational research because I cannot randomly assign you to having sex at a certain point in a relationship. But I think there are a few different reasons why this might be the case. We talked about the different aspects of love last week and how passion might not be the most firm foundation, and how emphasizing passion might make it more difficult for the intimacy to grow there. But I also think this harkens back to that misattribution of arousal. We said anything that gets your heart rate up, gets your blood pressure up, hyperventilating, can cause a person to feel like it's the person making them feel that way, when it's actually the situation making them feel that way. So perhaps this could cause people to feel like they're more intensely connected with the person than they actually are, which can lead to a lot of confusion later as well. So we tend to see that couples who wait longer are more likely on average to have better outcomes. Of course, that's not the case in every situation. So one thing to ask yourself is, why are people engaging in sexual activity? And yes, I am actually asking that question. Why are people engaging in sexual activity? Many different reasons that are listed here. As for the physical reasons, I feel like they explain themselves there. I'm sure somebody has had that conversation with you guys at this point. It's ironic. I'm always in the sexuality slides for my interpersonal relationships class and my biological class at the same time. And I'm like, wow, how many times have I said the word sex today? Anyway, certainly you've had some conversation at some point about the physical benefits of having sex, but other things as well. When it talks about emotional, and this could kind of tie into insecure too, the emotional thing could be that, you love a person, you want to express that you love a person, or maybe you're concerned that a person does not love you as much as you would like. And so maybe there's an insecure trying to change the way that a person feels about you there as well. What does pragmatic mean? If I were to ask you guys here, pragmatic is like a practical reason. Now, there could be many potential pragmatic reasons for having sex, but the two that come to my mind here would be pregnancy, like trying to get pregnant, or also possibly prostitution would also be a more practical, pragmatic reason. Now, do you need to understand why you're engaging in sexual behaviors? Like, what are your motivations? It might matter if two partners have different motives for engaging in sexual behavior. If for one, it's more emotional and the other, it's more physical, that could create a problem. If for one of them, it's more pragmatic, like, trying to get pregnant or whatever the case may be, then certainly you would like to be on the same page with your sexual partners as well, as far as why you're interested in engaging in that behavior and being honest with your partner, which then requires you to be honest with yourself as well. All right, another question that we might have here, how often are people having sex? Well, one part of this we've already discussed in our love slides. We talked about the 3 different components of love: intimacy, commitment, and passion. We said that passion declines with age, and we used one measure of passion as frequency of sexual intercourse. So we know that as individuals get older and as you're with the same partner longer, then that frequency of sexual interactions does decrease. So why is that? Well, some of that may be the novelty wearing off, having been with a partner for a longer period of time. Some of that may have to do with, as a person gets older, decreases in sex drive being more biological there. Could be health-related issues. On the other hand, when we're thinking about what causes a person to be more or less likely to be physically involved with their partners, it talks about spouses and cohabitating partners being more sexually active than singles. I think this makes sense. When you think about with spouses and cohabitating partners, like having a partner that's there and not having to find a partner, certainly would make this a little bit more likely that they would engage in sexual interactions. So when you're trying to make a determination here, you have to take several different variables into account. You need to take into account age, you need to take into account relationship status, and also you should remember that these are all generalized statements based on research with large groups of people. And so they don't necessarily generalize to any one person, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind. If we say married couples are having more sex, that doesn't mean all married couples are. On average, when you say older people are having less sex, that doesn't mean that all older people are having less sex. That's just on average. Another thing that's important here is sexual orientation. So your textbook really focuses on highlighting that there are a lot of things that are in common in different types of relationships. And there are some things that are certainly different. And this would be, a great conversation, and maybe we can have some conversation in class on Thursday as well. But one thing that your textbook talks about is the frequency of sexual interactions, that lesbian couples report having sex less often than other couples do. And then we could ask, why this might be. And once again, this is a general statement that does not necessarily apply to any one particular relationship, but on average, maybe this has to do with, females having a different view of love, maybe a different emphasis on intimacy and passion. Also, maybe this has to do with hormonal differences. We probably won't get there today, but about how men tend to have higher sex drives, and that is at least partly related to testosterone levels. So then this might tell us something then about heterosexual relationships if perhaps the male sex drive is the one that is setting the standard as far as how often sexual encounters are happening. Now, when we're looking at infidelity, it's important to have a pretty consistent definition of what we mean here. So it talks about most husbands, wives, couples not having extradyadic sex. So extradyadic sex here, when we talk about extradyadic, extra is like more, and dyadic refers to a dyad or two. So having a partner outside of the two that are involved in the relationship. This is not referring to an open marriage sort of situation or an open relationship here. When we're talking about extra dyadic, we're talking about like an affair that is not something that both partners have agreed to. Now, if you think about the numbers on this is definitely tricky. 1 out of every 5 wives and 1 out of every 3 husbands has admitted to engaging in infidelity. Now, that's, first of all, I think a pretty high number when you consider how many people have admitted that on a survey. And then the true number is probably much higher than that. You know, if we think about the Ashley Madison situation that I mentioned at some point this semester, about how there was a website that was dedicated to helping partners find someone to have an affair with, then people were concerned because someone hacked in, released all that information. I think people are afraid of telling the truth on a research study as well, afraid that information might become public knowledge. So on average, these are the numbers that we have to work with. Probably the true numbers are higher. If you look at these numbers, you'll notice that, at least on a survey, that husbands are more likely to cheat than wives. Now, I had one student make the argument here, and I do reserve the right, if you guys say something, interesting, to share it in the future semester with no identifying information. I did have one student who argued that women actually cheat more. It's just that men get caught more. And he was sure. He was just sure about that. So we could debate that. All we have is the information from a survey. So then what happens if the relationship is between 2 men? Now, I'm going to pull this up. You're going to see that certainly there are some problematic things with this particular research study. Here, they're asking about extradyadic sex, and gay men are reporting having extradyadic sex at much larger percentages than the other types of relationships, husbands, wives, cohabitators, lesbian relationships. They're all about the same. Now, problematic here. Is it problematic that your textbook is citing research from 1983? So I think a lot has changed here. A lot has changed in the attitudes that people have had. So I think that part of this may be there was more of a stigma about LGBT relationships in the past, and so they may have had smaller sample sizes here as far as people who were willing and comfortable to answer these questions. I think also there could have been differences in understandings of exactly what extradyadic sex meant, exactly what qualified here. So certainly this is potentially problematic. But one thought here is that this could make sense if testosterone was a big player in sexual behavior and infidelity in particular. So this is where I have this, for discussion. And so you can go in and type in your thoughts here. This is part of the extra credit for exam 2. So you could go in and answer this questionnaire if you'd like to get some extra credit. And we might talk about this a little bit in class on Thursday. Hopefully we'll be back in the classroom on Thursday. But what are your feelings about infidelity in a marriage situation? So when I talk about infidelity here, we're talking about something that's not an open relationship. We're talking about a situation where the other partner has not consented to this. Now, I mentioned marriage because that's a situation where I think we have different social norms. I think we would say that infidelity in a dating relationship is also an undesirable situation. But I think we'd say especially so in a marriage situation where you have that level of commitment. And then what exactly makes something an affair? Does it have to be physical? Could it be emotional? At what point is it an emotional affair? Like, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? And this is also where your views may be very different from the views of your classmates or from my views, and that's okay. You guys don't have to agree with me, but you should find a way to agree with, potential partners about what is acceptable and not acceptable in a relationship. Now, this is also where I had this conversation once with a student, one semester, where a student was very openly advocating for open marriage, as in like it's impossible monogamy is impossible and all of your partners are cheating on you, so you might as well get used to it. That was a very unpleasant situation where the atmosphere in the class was turned pretty aggressive pretty quickly. So I think what I would like to do is kind of leave this here for today, and then we should have some time in class on Thursday to kind of discuss, get your thoughts on some of the things that we've talked about today, and then also finish up this set of slides. So I'm going to leave this here. There's not an activity for you to worry about for today. You can go in and do this extra credit if you'd like to for extra credit for exam 2. And hopefully we'll be back in the classroom on Thursday to finish this up. So you guys have a great day. Stay warm.